Welcome back to Debate Clash. This is part 2 of the video addressing the public forum February 2017 topic, which is the United States should lift its embargo against Cuba. So let's jump right into it.
Yep, so again, this is part 2. This is the negative side, so if you want to watch the affirmative, check out part 1. Now we're going to have 3 categories, the same as we did in part 1, economic, other, and then like we always do, workarounds. So on to our first category here with economic arguments. Our first argument is going to be that Cuba has a regulated economy, so U.S. businesses would only help the government and not the people if we were to lift the embargo. Now, before I jump into this point, really make sure that you research how the Cuban economy works. It's going to be really important if you're running any sort of economic impacts or arguments in the round, and even if they are, so really just make sure you know how it works. It's going to be really important. The Cuban economy is essentially, because it's a communist state, the state owns the economy and runs it. So if a foreign company wants to open a business in Cuba, what they have to do is essentially tell the government, hey, I want to open this business, and then the country will give them the employees to run the business, and all of the pay and everything goes directly through the government. And so the government, what they are going to do is just skim off the top of everyone's pay and take a portion of it. And so really, by opening more businesses in Cuba, we're just giving the government more money and not helping the people at all, because they're still going to be making the same crappy, poor wage that they are.
Absolutely. And going into the economy as well, just a little bit more, one of the arguments that you can say is that the United States companies, by lifting this embargo and essentially allowing them into Cuba, this could hurt the Cuban economy a lot. When we're talking $1 billion, $2 billion, that's not very much for the United States or even for an American business. We have people that are worth a lot more than that in the United States. But that $1 or $2 billion is a ton of money in Cuba. That affects them drastically. So if U.S. companies are now allowed to come into Cuba and take a chunk or even a fraction of all of that money that was going through the state, you basically just created more overhead, which means that all of the Cuban individuals, their paychecks just took a cut. Or even there's potential that U.S. businesses could flood or saturate the market in Cuba, which could then later hurt the Cuban individuals even more. So it's definitely something to research into.
Exactly. And then also, along kind of these same lines, moving on to our next point, is that it's going to hurt American companies. So again, this is all based off of speculation. A lot of these points we're introducing conflict. So make sure when you're laying out your case, take the points that all align together. And so you don't have these points that are going to be conflicting with each other. What this point is saying is that if we open trade with Cuba, essentially that just opens another market and more businesses to compete with American businesses. So the best example is obviously Cuban cigars. I mean, you don't hear about cigars unless like they're Cuban, right? So what happens to American cigar makers if we open trade with Cuba? They go out of business, right? Because everyone's now buying Cuban cigars instead of American cigars. So you can use this argument as like an impact of how it can be negative to America to open trade with Cuba.
Absolutely. And then let's go over the final point under the economic category, which is the amount of money that we're talking about is not very much. I know I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this is probably your best defense. The affirmative is going to argue all day and night that we need to lift this embargo so that U.S. companies can start trading with the Cuban individuals and other Cuban companies. When you're talking about $1 billion for the United States, that's not very much. You can say all the other impacts that we're about to go into, that the economy is not very much. $1 billion in the economy every year is just not very much. And that's going to be probably your best defense against affirmatives that keep arguing that.
Exactly. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to our second category, which is just other arguments. We had a hard time categorizing them. So our first point here is that getting rid of the embargo would hurt our global hedge. So essentially what we're saying with this point is because we set out with this embargo to fulfill these goals with Cuba, if we were to release that, that pretty much sets the precedence that if we ever put an embargo on another country for a specific reason, if they just hold out long enough, we'll just give up and just, we don't want that embargo anymore. No, we need to actually continue and fulfill the goals that we set when we put this embargo in place.
Yep. And moving into the next argument under the other category is that the conflict has never really ended. Although we are making strides in the right direction with President Obama talking to Cuban leaders and us at least trying to establish ties, we've never really had a solid relationship, and it's not solid and predictable enough to end the embargo right now. And that's something that when you look at the resolution, it does state the United States should lift the embargo against Cuba. It doesn't say in a couple months, it doesn't say in a year, it says right at this exact moment we need to lift the embargo. So because relations aren't good enough right now in the present, we shouldn't lift the embargo yet.
Exactly. Now, moving on to our next point here, it's kind of a defensive point against the affirmative. What the affirmative might say is, we need to provide humanitarian aid, and in order to do that, we have to get rid of the embargo. So basically what this point wants to say is that we can still give humanitarian aid, and we can still help the Cuban people without lifting the embargo. So the embargo is in place to hurt the government, doing a little bit of research, over $1 billion a year is sent to Cuba from citizens in the United States every year. This is mostly from families to other family members living in Cuba. So money is going to them. They are being helped by people in the United States. And then not only that, but Congress since the early 2000s, so the total budget since the early 2000s, they've set aside several $100 million to promote humanitarian aid in Cuba. So help is getting to the people, even if the affirmative may say otherwise.
Exactly, and just like Michael described before about kind of how the Cuban economy works and how all the money filters through the Cuban government, that's why these embargoes are hurting the Cuban government, because we're restricting the Cuban government and not the people. Anyways, so going into the next point, which is that keeping the embargo at least creates a small incentive. However small it is, it's better than nothing, and it provides an incentive to reduce the amount of human rights abuses and at least allow them to take strides in the right direction. It tells them that us as the United States do not appreciate what you're doing and you should stop it. It's kind of like with your mom, when she tells you, yes, I love you, and we're good, but you better get your chores done this Saturday. So the embargo is just that little message at the end where it says, yes, we want to work with you, it's fantastic, but make sure that you're doing what we tell you.
Exactly. So moving on to the next point here, as you probably heard in the news, this last November, in 2016, Fidel Castro died. His brother Raul is still in power in Cuba, but he's in his late 80s. So we don't really know what's going to happen when he dies. He could die pretty soon. He's a fairly old guy. So we don't want to lift the embargo when he dies, an entirely different regime could take power in Cuba. We want to make sure that the waters are steady and still, and we know what's happening when we lift the embargo, so it's more, it just causes less turmoil that way.
Absolutely. And the next point, which is that you can argue, and kind of the last argument in this other category, which is that the stance that America is taking, regardless of the consequences, is morally or ethically correct. And I'm not going to tell you which philosophical branch to go research or go do, because so many of them talk about the moral right and wrongness of our decisions. But what you can say is that it's right for America to stand up against human rights abuses. It's right for America to take a stand against individuals or governments that are suppressing people's freedom of speech, so on and so forth. So you can definitely take this from a philosophical side and win as well.
Exactly. So now we're going to move on to our workarounds section. Now the first point here is going to be a framework. Now, like we've said in our first part video, if you don't know what a framework is, or if you don't know how to implement one or use one, check out Nico's video. It's on our channel. He explains awesomely what one is, how to use it, everything about it. So check that out. So onto this first point, this first framework. Basically, it says that we should only end the embargo if Cuba meets the requirements that we put in place when we enacted the embargo. So just so you know, just so you have a few examples of what these are, obviously research them yourselves. But one was that Cuba should have fair elections. They should have freedom of press. They should respect humanitarian rights, because there's a lot of humanitarian abuses that go on in Cuba. So until these things are fulfilled, until Cuba is doing these things, that we shouldn't lift the embargo. Basically, this is going to put the proof the burden of proof on the affirmative and take some off of you to help you out.
Yeah, and going into the next workaround, which is actually an observation, and we kind of have mentioned it a little bit throughout this video, which is the United States, or the affirmative, needs to say that right now the embargo is lifted. It isn't in a couple months, it's not in a year, it's right now the embargo is lifted. And just like Michael mentioned with Raul taking power and Fidel Castro passing, or I guess Raul was in power, but he's getting very old, and Fidel Castro passing, a lot of things in Cuba are changing, and so it's the mystery of we don't know what's going to happen. We should keep things the same until we know. So this is a fantastic framework to run and just say, yeah, maybe in a couple of years it might be right to lift the embargo, but right now it's too mysterious. It's too soon. We don't know.
Exactly. Now this next framework we want to bring up is essentially stating that the side with the lowest chance of something bad happening should win the round. So how this benefits you is because you're saying keep the embargo, keep the status quo. We know we know what the status quo is. We know what's going to keep happening. We don't know what's going to happen if we get rid of the embargo. And so essentially the negative should win the round because something bad isn't going to happen, and we know that.
Exactly. You stay the same and nothing's going to change. And the final workaround that we have is another framework, which is that you can, or I guess not really a framework, but you can propose alternatives to the plan. And I know that there's a lot of conflicting opinions about whether alternatives should be able to be proposed in public forum. So definitely ask your coach, ask your veteran debaters on your team before you run these, ask your judge for sure. But anyways, a couple of alternatives that you can run that are not counterplans are that the United States can revise the embargo. In the 90s, they definitely tightened the embargo on Cuba. They've made so many little changes in the past. There's no reason why we can't say, hey, yeah, Cuba, we are getting along great. You're making strides in the right direction, and therefore we are going to reduce it by half, or we are going to loosen the embargo, right? That is a fantastic alternative without completely removing it, but also not going into the full risk. Yeah, not going into the full risk of removing it. Another alternative that you can propose is that right now the United States is kind of unilaterally making this embargo. They said, here's a bunch of our requests, you better do it, and we're not lifting this embargo until you do those things. So it might be a good alternative to sit down with Cuba, talk to them, and say, what can you do, what can we do, and kind of reestablish this embargo so that we have a mutually beneficial relationship that would be, better for Cuba and the United States. So there are a couple other alternatives. Feel free to brainstorm yourself. But yeah, anyways, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Good luck in February 2017. Make sure you subscribe, like the video, and visit the Debate Clash Marketplace. See ya!